Hello and welcome to another episode of Reworked. I'm Dave and this is episode 4 of the suspension refresh on my father's 1967 Volvo 1800S. At the end of the last episode, we had finally gotten the new steering idler arm bushing pressed in, and now we're going to continue with the assembly of the front crossmember and front wishbones, which is going to involve the compression of the springs, and then we'll install the shock absorbers, and there'll be work compressing the shock absorbers to get them inside the shock tower and the lower wishbone far enough that I can bolt the access plate on the lower wishbone on. I discussed spring compression in the intro to the previous video, but I'm going to recap it here. The wheel hub assembly attaches to the rest of the front suspension via connection to the upper ball joint, which is attached to the upper wishbone, and to the lower ball joint, which is attached to the lower wishbone. And in order to bring the wishbones together to the dimension of the kingpins, the distance between the kingpins on the back of the wheel assembly, you have to compress the spring. The Volvo Green Book manual assumes that you're doing this job with the front suspension in the car, and therefore the way they recommend you compress the spring is to put a jack under the lower wishbone and jack it up until these line up. And I considered putting this front suspension back in the car and trying it that way, but without the weight of the engine on the engine mounts on the front crossmember, I wasn't sure that it would compress the spring. I felt like it might just jack the car up, so I didn't bother with that. That left looking for ways to compress the spring here with the whole front suspension out on the floor. So the first thing I looked at was this spring compressor tool, but as you can see, it's bigger than the dimension that we need to compress, so that's of no use. And I then went ahead with medium ratchet strap here and here and compressed it, although it was a little ugly, and you'll see that in the video. A suggestion from a member of the Facebook Volvo P1800 Restoration Club group was to create a spring compressor to go down through the hole in the shock tower with the shock out, and with these large washers tighten the nuts, thereby drawing the lower wishbone up and compressing the spring. And I didn't try that method because I had already finished the job with the ratchet strap, but I think the threaded rod method may work better, may be easier, and it would certainly be more adjustable in terms of how much you're actually compressing the spring. With the ratchet strap, you only move one click at a time, and then you can't back up. And you can't back up one click, you have to release the tension on the strap, and it goes way back and you start over. So the threaded rod method is probably the way to go. Now we'll move on into the video, and you'll see the trials and tribulations of the way I did it with the ratchet strap, and then we'll get into reinstallation of the shock absorbers. The shock absorbers are already installed at the beginning of this episode because I had done them with the ratchet strap, but later I was told that you're supposed to compress and extend the shocks several times vertically to avoid gas bubbles that may be in them from horizontal shipping. And so I took them out via the plate at the bottom of the lower wishbone. So you just undo this nut, undo the plate on the lower wishbone, pull it on out. So you'll see me putting those back in, and the spring is compressed and the wishbones are together, but I still have to compress the shock to fit that dimension, and that took a little work. So that's what we're going to cover in this episode. Let's get started. And something that I should have seen coming when I named the channel Reworked, I now have to do some rework of my own work. So when I named it, I was thinking reworking work of 50, 60 years ago when these cars were built. But turns out that I made a couple mistakes in this area of the installation. This is an edit to the original Part 4 assembly video because a viewer who is more knowledgeable about Volvos than I contacted me on the P1800 list, email list, to let me know that I had made a mistake with the bushings here on the upper control arm. In the original video, I look at the rubber bushings that don't have the metal core around them and say, well, hey, I guess they changed the part. That was an error. At that point, I should have asked myself, how is it possible that a bushing could change as much as removing a bunch of metal and still work? So what didn't occur to me at the time was that that metal core is not sold with the new bushing, and you have to cut the old bushing out and put it in to the metal core. So he contacted me and said, the way you assembled it with these U-bolts riding on just that rubber is not going to last very long. So thank you very much to him for informing me not only for the health of my car, but I would not want to have the video informing people to do it wrong and be responsible for problems with other people's cars. So I'm going to edit in swapping those metal cores into the bushings and putting them back together. That was difficult without releasing the springs, and I didn't want to start over. And in the end, I made it work. I think I did it with less work than starting over, but what I ended up doing, see, the spring is contained or held by the two kingpins in the wheel assembly on this end, and the spring tension goes up into the top of the shock tower. The spring, well, it doesn't go all the way up there, it's down at this part, but the force of the spring is between the lower wishbone and this part of the front crossmember, and so there's not a whole bunch of force on this end of the upper wishbone, but there's some, and it's enough that you take one of these off, and I took them off one at a time, hoping that the other one would hold it, and the wishbone starts to yaw, and it's more force than I can just push back, and so I ended up trying various configurations of the ratchet strap. That didn't work very well. In the end, what did work was these ratcheting C-clamps. It's easier on this side because there's more flat spots to grab onto. This side was a little harder, but I used them to keep the upper wishbone from yawing too much, and then when I was ready to put the U-bolt through, I could pull it down with channel locks, pliers, and the challenge then was to get the U-bolt through far enough and then get the channel locks out after I got a couple threads on these nuts. So that worked. So I'm glad that I was told of the problem and could fix it and correct the video. The other thing he mentioned, he gave me a better diagram of the original configuration of the shocks than I had from the parts diagram, and it called out this cup washer here that has a lip that fits the hole in the upper shock tower, and its job is to center this rubber bushing and keep it aligned, and that's not in the generic pictogram descriptions from KYB shocks, because that set of instructions is for any car. Basically, it had multiple configurations, and I didn't notice that this was different on the old shocks when I took it apart. So I came back and fixed that. It was easy because all I had to do was back this off, pull off the cup washer, the bushing, and then put that new washer in. And although it's installed here and you can't see it, I have some footage of the close-up of the washer, and I'll put that in. So I'm going to edit the parts of the original video to say here's the error I'm making as I make it, and then I'll put in the fixes to show doing it right. That way you have some continuity with the video. And so I've got all that done. Hopefully there are no other major problems. One other commenter asked me if I had put any anti-seize on this bolt, and I had not. So this lower wishbone bolt. So I guess I'll go look for some of that at auto parts store, hardware store, and put that on. And I think that'll do it for now. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll continue with the rest of the installation in the video in its normal order, and then when we get to this part, I'll splice in the fixes. All right, now to assemble the front suspension, I already did one end, upper wishbone, lower wishbone, spring and shock, ball joints, new bushings on the wishbones. All right, here's the finished upper wishbone on the other side. Here's the top of the shock absorber. And before I realized they had two different size nuts, I used the low profile nut. Then the top of the modern style ball joints, the old ones came up farther. This is the back of the rubber stop that's in the upper ball joints. I didn't change that out. They seemed in good condition, and they're a real pain to change out because they just press through the hole and then expand. So when I did it on that car, it took me a while to get that pushed through, so I'm just saved myself that effort on this one. But here's how the upper wishbone attaches. So we've got this piece, two bolts. Got to remember the fold down safety that keeps the bolt from backing out. It's supposed to have both sides, but I guess this side broke off. Two U-bolts and their nuts, and then large washer and bolt on either end. And that there's a spec on tightening the U-bolts so that it still has some give. If you tighten them up too much, it won't move. So when we get to that step, I'll read the spec. Doesn't seem to be a spec on these. So we'll replicate that on this side. It may seem obvious that this tab on the lower wishbone goes to the front of the car, and these circular brackets also go to the front of the car. So you want the circular bracket on the same side as this tab, and I'm going to get lined up, and the giant bolt, the bolt head is on the front of the car and the nut is at the back. So bolt coming through. Takes a little wiggling and movement. May even need to get a socket and turn it. And try to make sure it's there. It goes. A little turning, make sure it's lined up on the other side, and it goes right through. Then the large cup washer facing in, and 7/8 nut. There's a torque spec for this, so I'm going to go look it up. Alright, now to put the lower wishbone on, this will be the passenger side of the car. I'm sorry, upper wishbone on the passenger side of the car. We have the wishbone bolt, the locking plate, kind of a lock washer, and these two bolts, and when we are ready to tighten it down, need to put in these spacers. Come in various thicknesses. These are original spacers and shims, and it's how they squared up the geometry at the factory. Shims here and shims where the front cross section meets the body of the car. And so when I took it apart, I recorded on video how many shims on which end of the bolt on both sides. So before I torque everything down to final, I'll put the shims in. Now there doesn't seem to be a torque spec on these bolts. There is a torque spec on the nuts on either end, because that tightens it down, keeps it from being able to rotate around this pin. So my 5/8 socket I seem to have misplaced, so for now just lightly tighten it down with my 5/8 wrench. Now there are bushings go on here that the wishbone rides in, and the old ones had a metal core with this gap that the U-bolt rode in, and the new ones are just rubber. So I don't know if this is a case where replacement parts are not as good as original, or whether the originals were over-designed or what, but that is what I was able to buy in the front end refurb kit from VP. So we need our U-joints. Assemble it. So the torque spec on these bolts on the U-joints is 18 foot-pounds. And then the torque spec on the bolts on either end is 40 foot-pounds. So I'll snug these up and then we'll get the torque wrench later. Alright, so torque spec in the book is actually 14 to 18 foot-pounds. When I spoke of it earlier, I gave the upper limit. So I'm setting this to 17 foot-pounds. And we'll tighten until we hear the full beep. Alright, it can still move. Now the bolts on either end. Alright, when I went to put on the washer and nut here, I found that the bushing on this side was not centered on the U-bolt and had fallen down here, so I had to loosen the U-bolts. To fix that, now we need to re-torque it to the 14 to 18 spec, so torque it to 17. There we go. Now the 3/4 nut and the large flat washer, and we torque this to 36 to 40. And that's a 3/4. So I'll set my torque wrench to 39. There we go. Alright, 39 on both of them. So it still moves some, kind of springy on the rubber. The ball joints. So here's one that goes up here. I've got the bolts upside down when I just packaged it to keep everything together. This bracket has the upper bump stop. I replaced those. Unlike these that are pressed through, the upper bump stop goes on with a nut and bolt, so easy install. No reason not to replace them. So ball joint and bracket line up from what looks like above, but you know we're upside down, so it's below. And then the bump stop goes below the other side of the wishbone. And then bolt with a new nylon lock nut. (11/16). Alright, there's no torque spec on these, just tighten them as you would any 11/16 bolt into steel, which means pretty tight. And then the other ball joint, part number 273030. It's the same on both sides, same part number. And it's a little different than the original design. Well, here's the original, either from 84 or from 67, but you can see it poke through this. We're upside down now, so this is the upper wishbone, and you'd see some of it above the upper wishbone. And this one won't have much above that. Remember to take off the cap that is protecting the rubber boot. And this one mounts from below with bolt head here and nylon lock nut on the other side of the upper wishbone. And so when this thing is flipped over in its installed position, you'll see the extra 1/2 inch or 3/4 of inch of the bolt sticking up through the nut. There we go. Alright, no torque spec for this one either. Alright, now to attach the wheel spindle slash hub slash disc slash caliper bracket to the wishbones, you have to compress that spring again, this time further than before. You can see we need it go about 2.5 inches just to start engaging the ball joint. Remember that even if it feels stiff, you can move this around. You're going to want to move it to line it up. I put a little grease on it because on the other side, the first 4 times I tried, it would kind of bind up. All right. I think I don't want to start over. It wants to pop out. Once again, it's like it's passing an inflection point. It does not want to stop where it would work. I have to say that I greatly prefer the BMW 2002 front suspension, where you can use a regular, normal-sized spring compressor. Okay. There. Okay. All right. The bottom of the ball joint shaft is not quite through. Okay, I can see the bolt finally now. All right, one more click and the notch looks like it'll be in place. All right, well, this may be a problem. The notch is half a click. Don't know how I'm gonna, yeah, it won't go there. That was good. It remained. Got a knot. Damn it. I do not want to start over. Okay, so since evidence would say it's not going to end on a click or line up on a click, I'm going to have to lean on the ratchet and get that last half click. That. There we go. Whew. Way more work than the other one. And I'll get the nut started so that make sure that my bolt doesn't somehow back out. And undo the strap. So I guess first thing I have to do is tighten that down so I don't forget. I believe it's a 1/2 inch. Yep. All right. All right, I used my air reciprocating saw to remove this, and I did it a different way. Instead of sawing in this dimension, I just sawed the end off and pulled it out pretty easily. That worked great on this one. So the last one I did that too, and I haven't tried to pull it out yet, so let's see how well that works. The other one came out by hand. I didn't even have to use a screwdriver or a... There we go. There we go. All right, so I have the two cores here ready for use here. So let's take the U-bolt off and see what happens. All right, now for the moment of truth. All right, now press one into soapy water. Get the edge in, then just press. And then the raised edge will eventually pop out. There we go. Now, a little more soapy water on the inside. So it's trying to do what it did before, and that is back off around the corner. It's still in a good enough position that if I can get the bushing in, that I can close it. All right, so releasing that clamp gives me the room to put it in. Let's just hope the clamp goes back, because this is where we ran into the difficulty on the last one. Yeah, same thing here. The hole in the upper wishbone is rotated back that way, so it's not lined up with the groove anymore. But that's bringing it back in line. This type of clamp is magic. So, and again, I have to go get the torque set to fit for this and these. I think the U-bolt one is maximum of 18 foot-pounds, like 14 to 18, and I think this one might be 40, but I'll have to look it up. I guess the lessons learned are, if you're cutting these up, just cut the end off and pull it out rather than cutting through the core. And then you shouldn't be doing this job at all, because you should have not made the mistake I made in trying to put this on without releasing the spring. So I guess it's going to be a very small percentage of people who would ever need to try what I just did, which is keeping the spring compressed, keeping the kingpins in the ball joints, and then redoing these bushings. All right, these are the KYB gas shocks. I bought them from VP Auto Parts along with all the other parts that I use today. And they sell an oil shock, a gas shock, and Bilsteins in order of price there. And I put Bilsteins on my other 67 because I had lowering springs on it, and I wanted a sportier feel. But in this case, I want it. I'm going with OEM springs and non-sporting shocks. So to go ahead and compress it to do this bubble clearing that the pictogram calls for, I've got a couple pieces of wood to make it something that you can press without hurting your hands. Compress it down, let it come back up. And compress it down again, let it come back up. Now I've already done this a couple times before that. The pictogram doesn't say how many times, so I'm assuming 3 or 4 will do it. The assembly order is essentially to create a sandwich of the rubber bumpers at the mounting point. So you start with a cup washer, then a rubber bumper. The bumper has 2 different diameter raised areas. The instructions say to pick the one that matches the hole in the plate you're going through. So rubber bumper goes on. Now here's the plate. And since we're dealing with the bottom of it here, it goes like that. Then another rubber bumper to hold the other side of the plate. Then cup washer pointing up. And then we would put the nut on it. Now to address the question of correct order of washers for the shock installation, this is the version of the pictogram instructions that came with the shocks, and it's not very large and it's poorly printed, and some things are very difficult to see. For instance, this version of the compress and uncompress the shocks is like in halftone or something, so I didn't see that originally. I didn't know to do that step until a viewer online sent me a digital copy of the pictogram, which was easier to use. And then down here in the various installation methods portion, depending on the layout, like here's some for shocks that mount with a horizontal bolt, etc. But here's the relevant frame for our installation, and it shows cup washer at the top, nut, cup washer pointed down, rubber bushing, and then the material of the shock tower. Another viewer pointed out that the original Volvo parts manual has this additional washer, which is not only a cup washer pushing up on the towards the bushing, but it has this wider lip that fits the hole in the top of the shock tower, and it keeps the bushing centered. So here I went back and looked at these shocks. These are the ones that were on the car, but this pair had this special cup washer we're talking about. Here's that cup washer from the other shock, the top one. You can see the lip, the raised area there that keeps it centered in the bushing, or keeps the bushing centered above the hole through the upper shock mount. Alright, looking at the lower wishbone from below, you can see the hole in the wishbone. We'll put the shock assembly up through it and wiggle it around until we get it to come through the top. And then I'm going to have to compress it to put the two bolts here that hold this plate at the bottom end of the lower wishbone. And the way it's moving like that, I can see that I'm going to have to take this down and put it on its side to do that. So I'll take this out and reposition it. Now that I've set the entire front suspension on its side and it's more stable, I've been able to put the shock up through the hole in the bottom of the lower wishbone, up through the spring, out through the top of the shock tower. Now the job is going to be to compress the strut this distance, get these two bolts in that hold this plate to the lower wishbone, and then I can go ahead and put the lower cup washer and nut on. So I guess I'm just going to have to push on this and compress it like I did to get the bubbles out of it. Hopefully not end up pushing this entire assembly around while it's doing that. All right. All right. So, absent a helper, the key here is holding it in place with your knee. All right, I've got the first bolt in. And the trouble I'm having is compressing this side of the plate until it allows me to get the second bolt started. And it's probably doable. I've been trying here for a few minutes, but I decided I would just save myself the trouble and bring out a C-clamp. All right, got that in. Pretty sure not cross-threaded. Now I can release the C-clamp, tighten them both up. Okay. Now we already have the bumper, cup washer up. Tighten down the nut a little bit. And then you do the final tightening once the weight is on the car. And I'm not sure what the torque spec is, so I'm going to have to look it up. I've compressed the KYB gas shock 4 times, and now ready to put it in this case the passenger side lower wishbone, and wiggle it around until the top of the strut or shock comes out the top, and then put on the rubber bumper, cup washer pointed down, and then put on the nut. And now all we've got to do is compress this, get these 2 bolts into these 2 holes. Alright, because it kept wanting to move as I pressed on this, I flipped it over so the pressing is going into the ground somewhat. It's not vertical, but hopefully it'll do better. And get the bolts lined up. Ready, I mean. And alright, I think this might be the easiest way to do it. Well, it's a lot easier to hold compressed when you're pressing down on the floor. Alright. Got the first one started. Now on the other side, because I hadn't turned it over, pushing at the floor, I ended up using the C-clamp here. But I think pushing into the floor, I can just easily put this in. There we go. Much easier than the alternatives. And now, oh, cup washer and nut are already on the bottom one. I never took it off. So that's it. We got the shocks pulled out, gone through their compression for bubbles, got them put back in, and did not have to involve taking out the uncompressing the spring by removing the upper and lower wishbones. Okay, well, that little cup washer is going down into the top of the shock tower, which is what it's supposed to do. So I guess that's successful. All right, with that, we've got the front suspension put back together, all the major components cleaned, painted, all the wear items replaced. We got the bushings pressed out, new ones pressed in, new tie rod ends, new ball joints, and new shocks, plus the wheel bearings and the lower bump stops. So it's ready to go back in the car. If you're going to go the method of putting your engine installing the engine through the hood opening, you could mount the front suspension in the car and then lower the engine onto it. I prefer the method of mounting the engine onto the front suspension and with the transmission attached to the engine, and then rolling it under the car and lowering the body down onto it. And that's what I'll be doing as soon as I get the work done on the engine bay, which still needs some disassembly, some cleaning, and some repainting. I learned a number of lessons by doing things wrong along the way with this project, including the various methods I tried to get the shock absorbers compressed to get those bottom plates on the lower wishbones. We've already talked about the spring compression, how I did it with the ratchet straps, and how I think the threaded rod version would be better. I'm still considering putting reinforcement plates here on the top of the shock towers. There's some discussion of that online. People with high mileage cars have had, or people who have rallied them or raced, have had the top of the shock towers fail. This car only has, I think, 70,000 miles, and it probably is going to be driven very sparingly, so I'm not sure I need the reinforcement plates. The conventional wisdom is do it while it's out of the car. I've also read an opinion that very large washers will spread the load just as well, so like 2-inch washers up here. So I don't know whether the welding of reinforcement plates is strictly necessary. I'm going to continue reading up on that. But anyway, front section will be out of the car for a while, and if it's necessary, I may come back and weld those in. I hope that this has been helpful, informative, and maybe would help you with your Volvo project. I know that if I were to do this project again tomorrow, I would be significantly faster, since I've tried all the ways to do it wrong and finally learned the ways that worked. So learn from my mistakes, and hopefully this helps you out. I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe, like, and share, and I'll see you in the next video when we get to working on the engine bay and eventually putting everything back together in the car.